You can't just build wherever you want. This is protected land.
I have all the necessary permits, ma'am.
I came back from deployment to discover my grandfather's cabin reduced to nothing but shattered boards and rubble. Standing in my driveway was the HOA president, smirking as she handed me a demolition invoice for $12,000, claiming I owed back fees that never legally existed. What she didn't realize was that my whole family works for the federal government. Dad's with the FBI investigating white-collar crime. Mom, IRS Criminal Division. My sister, ATF. And me, military intelligence. The sharp bite of diesel still clung to the mountain air, blending with the sweet, broken scent of cedar logs that once held generations of Christmas mornings and summer fishing trips. I stood in the ruins of what used to be our kitchen, staring at this woman who had just made the single worst mistake of her corrupt little life. Vivian Blackthorne thought she was steamrolling over some defenseless veteran's cabin. Instead, she had just declared war on a family task force that only looked like a Sunday dinner table. Tell me, what would you do if spite alone drove someone to destroy your family's legacy? And where are you watching from? Drop your location below. But to understand this mess, let's rewind 18 months to where it all began. My name is Marcus Sterling. I'm 52. I spent 25 years in Army logistics before I finally wised up and retired to the mountains. My Uncle Theodore left me a small lakeside cabin in Colorado, a place I thought was just another quiet retreat. He was always the family oddball, living like a recluse but somehow had money tucked away in all sorts of places. The cabin itself wasn't impressive. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a kitchen frozen in 1970. But that view? Worth everything. Sitting on the back porch with a hot mug of coffee, watching mist curl off glass-still water while loons traded calls. That's what peace feels like after decades of military noise. The lake was shaped like a teardrop, about 47 acres of untouched mountain water, ringed with a dozen simple homes. Nothing fancy, just folks wanting quiet retirements. Or so I thought, until Karen Whitmore showed up. She moved in 3 doors down about 6 months after I did. White BMW, white teeth, white lies. Everything about her screamed, "I don't fit in here, but I'm taking over anyway." She was 48, a real estate agent, married to some city council hopeful named Derek. Within 2 weeks, she'd made herself HOA president. Shocking how easy that is when no one else wants the job. The first warning sign came when she introduced herself. I was down at the dock tinkering with my boat engine, a Chris Craft I'd bought wrecked and spent 3 painstaking years restoring. Every bolt, every strip of mahogany, every polished piece of chrome was rebuilt by hand. She clattered down in high heels, plastered on her realtor smile, and said, "Oh, you're the military man." Then, with just enough sugar to mask the venom, "Well, I hope you understand we have certain standards around here." That phrase dripped condescension, and soon enough, the boat became her obsession. Too big, too noisy, she said. Didn't fit her grand vision for the community. Never mind that plenty of neighbors had boats just as large. Never mind that mine was the most beautiful vessel on the lake. Karen had decided I was the problem, and Karen always got what she wanted. Her perfume, expensive enough to cover my grocery budget, lingered on the dock long after she left, but against the honest scent of cedar shingles warming in the morning. Sun and creosote rising from old pilings, it felt like an invasion, like spraying fake flowers into a real garden. The first violation notice came on a Tuesday. Crisp white paper, HOA letterhead, legal jargon stacked high enough to scare anyone who didn't know better. Oversized recreational vessel in violation of Covenant 14.7b, $200 daily fine until removed. Here's the thing military service teaches you: never react before gathering intel. So instead of blowing up, I started digging. Who was this woman who thought she could order a retired Army officer off his own property? And more importantly, what didn't I know about Uncle Theodore's gift that might flip this whole situation upside down? Because if there's one thing 25 years in logistics taught me, it's this: the side with the best information wins. And I had a feeling Karen hadn't done nearly as much homework as she thought. Vivian's first big power play happened while my boots were still muddy from German soil. She called an emergency HOA meeting for a Wednesday afternoon at 2 p.m., right in the middle of the workday, when anyone with a real job couldn't show up. It's strange how these so-called emergencies always pop up when the very people being targeted aren't around to defend themselves. At a cozy little meeting of 7 hand-picked folks in her living room, because apparently that's what democracy looks like in Vivian's universe, she pushed through something she labeled a special assessment resolution. Just like that, our family cabin was declared in violation of architectural standards that didn't even exist when my grandfather built it. But this was where Vivian revealed her true talent for bureaucratic warfare. She cranked out a violation report that ran 47 pages long. I wish I were exaggerating. 47 pages dedicated to a modest family cabin. According to her, our dock was oversized at 12 by 8 feet. The wildflower garden, grown from native seeds, was suddenly unapproved landscaping that disrupted neighborhood aesthetics. And the fire pit my grandfather built for roasting marshmallows? Branded an unregistered combustible hazard posing an immediate threat to community safety. Somehow she managed to transform a beloved retreat into the equivalent of a federal disaster zone, complete with falsified, backdated paperwork designed to look as though we'd been ignoring violation notices for months, while I was overseas. Analyzing enemy communications, Vivian was fabricating evidence like she'd been trained by an intelligence agency. By the time I came back from deployment, a pile of legal paperwork sat on my doorstep, thick enough to stop shrapnel. The cabin itself was already starting to rot. Months of forced neglect had left it with that damp, sour smell of mold creeping through the windows, replacing the pine-scented air and warmth of family dinners. That's when my training kicked in. In military intelligence, every situation is treated like an enemy operation. Map out the players, understand their motives, trace communication lines, and identify weaknesses. So I cleared the kitchen table and began building a threat assessment board, the same way I once tracked Taliban networks in Afghanistan. I brought our case to military legal aid, where Captain Rodriguez nearly spit out her coffee after reading. Vivian's stack of nonsense. Sergeant Garrison, this is a textbook violation of the Service Members Civil Relief Act, she said. They cannot take enforcement action against deployed service members without following federal notification. Protocols. That was the moment I learned something crucial. Federal law exists specifically to shield military families from exactly this kind of ambush while we're overseas. But the real bombshell came when I reached out to our property management company. My parents had hired them to handle routine upkeep during my deployment, yet they had abruptly stopped all services 3 months prior. The manager finally confessed Vivian had threatened to pull their contractor license unless they abandoned our property. She had weaponized her construction industry ties to cut us off, siege warfare carried out with building permits. So I dug deeper, applying the same methodical approach I'd used overseas. Public records, corporate filings, financial disclosures, all legal intelligence gathering. That's when I struck gold. The HOA's corporate registration had expired 8 months earlier. Legally, they had no enforcement authority. Vivian had been running a ghost HOA, the equivalent of discovering your opponent forgot to officially form an army. Meanwhile, her behavior only made the irony sweeter. Her BMW cruised past our property at odd surveillance hours, 2 a.m., 5:30 a.m., random weekday afternoons. That engine's growl became my daily reminder that she was more anxious about us than we needed to be about her. Amateur surveillance at best, especially against someone trained in real intelligence work. Word spread. Neighbors quietly began sharing their own horror stories. The local hardware store owner admitted certain customers mysteriously couldn't get supplies. 3 other lakefront families were enduring nearly identical harassment campaigns, fabricated violations, strategic timing, intimidation tactics. You could feel the tension building across the community, that charged energy right before someone finally pushes back against the local tyrant. It reminded me of those moments before a mission goes live. Walking our property with a measuring tape and camera, frost crunching under my boots, I felt the weight of preparation settle in. This was a battlefield now. Vivian had declared war on my family while I was serving abroad. What she didn't grasp was that she had handed a military intelligence analyst the perfect domestic case study. Every forged document, every procedural shortcut, every shady deal with contractors, it all became evidence, logged with the same precision I'd once used to dismantle insurgent networks. She thought she was crushing a defenseless military family. In reality, she'd given a federal analyst front-row insight into how local corruption operates. 2 weeks later, Vivian escalated again, this time to full-blown psychological warfare. She filed a county safety complaint, claiming our dock was a drowning hazard for neighborhood kids, never mind the fact that the same 12-by-8 dock had safely hosted 3 generations of garrison children learning to swim without a single mishap. And her timing? Interesting, to say the least. She scheduled the inspection for 10 a.m. on a Tuesday, right when most working families were at their jobs. Pure coincidence, I'm sure. The inspector was a man named Dale Henricks, mid-50s, the type who drives a lifted truck with novelty truck nuts on the hitch and calls everyone buddy with a tone that means the opposite. What I didn't know then, but my sister Mackenzie at the ATF later uncovered, was that Dale had already been flagged in federal databases for taking contractor kickbacks. His specialty was finding structural problems that just happened, to require costly fixes from his friends in the business, like a coroner who only ever diagnoses deaths that benefit the funeral home paying his golf dues. Fortunately, I'd set up trail cameras around the property, perfectly legal and second. Nature after 18 months scanning for insurgent activity. The footage I captured could have rivaled a Netflix drama. There was Vivian walking the dock with Dale 3 days before the official inspection, measuring, photographing, deep in conversation about structural integrity. The whole scene reeked, his cheap cologne mixing with lake air, a farce that would have been comical if it weren't so obviously criminal. You start to pick up on these kinds of details in intelligence work. When people try to look by the book while doing something blatantly crooked, their giveaways practically glow. During the so-called official inspection, Dale spent all of 4 minutes looking over our dock before declaring it unsafe and a danger to the public. His written report said the support posts were heavily deteriorated and on the verge of collapse. The funny part, just 6 months earlier, a licensed marine contractor had inspected and certified the dock as sound. Yet Dale's narrative made it seem like we'd slapped the thing together out of toothpicks and blind faith. That evening, I called for a family war council. It was the first time we'd all been under one roof since my deployment, and the dining room practically hummed with focused fury. Dad brought his FBI case file mindset. Mom had her IRS-trained eye for forensic finances. Mackenzie showed up with ATF database access and a skill set tailored for tracking people who misuse authority. "This is classic racketeering," Dad said, spreading Dale's report across the table, exploiting official procedures for personal profit in coordination with others. "If we can establish a pattern, this crosses into federal RICO territory." Mom was already digging through property tax databases on her laptop. Turns out Vivian had been marking neighboring parcels as abandoned or condemned to slash her own. Tax bill. She was literally making money off harassing her neighbors. That's when I learned something I wish I'd known earlier. Corrupt local officials often fake property issues so they can manipulate tax assessments to their benefit. But Mackenzie dropped the real bombshell. Her ATF search revealed that Dale had been tied to a 2019 bridge collapse that killed 2 people. His inspection license should have been revoked permanently, but somehow he was still working, illegally. The man hired to keep structures safe was himself a walking safety hazard with blood already on his hands. Emergency inspections require explicit statutory authority under Montana law, Mackenzie explained while printing database files. Most HOA emergencies don't actually meet that definition. They just manufacture urgency to skip proper procedures. The next morning, Vivian rolled up with a demolition crew, claiming she had the authority to secure the dangerous dock for public safety. Picture it. 5 men with chainsaws and sledgehammers ready to tear apart private property without a warrant, acting on the word of an unlicensed fraud who'd already gotten people killed. This is where military training comes in handy in civilian life. I walked out onto that dock, the one supposedly collapsing under its own weight, and calmly told them they were trespassing without lawful authority. Everything was documented on video. my tone polite but unshakably firm. "Ma'am," I told Vivian, "if you truly believe you have legal authority here, you're welcome to call the sheriff. I'll wait." The look on her face was priceless. The instant realization that her bluff had been called by someone who actually knew the rules. The air was electric, like the charged silence before a thunderstorm. Her crew glanced around nervously, clearly calculating whether wrecking property-based on bogus paperwork was worth their hourly pay. The sound of chainsaws going quiet was better than any victory song. That's when I knew we had her. Vivian had escalated from paper harassment to attempted physical destruction, on fraudulent grounds. She had just gift-wrapped us a federal case strong enough to keep prosecutors busy for months. 3 weeks later, Vivian went full nuclear. Using Dale's falsified report, she convinced the county to issue an official demolition order. Our family cabin, 4 decades of history, built to last another 100 years, was suddenly condemned as an imminent danger to public safety and property values. But here's the thing about Vivian. She was a master of psychological warfare, and she knew how to time her strikes. The demolition was scheduled for the Friday right after Thanksgiving. Perfect timing, when families are full of turkey and no one's watching local government paperwork. Maximum emotional impact, minimum. Public witnesses. We had all gathered at the cabin for what we thought would be an ordinary Thanksgiving. The smell of Mom's sage stuffing mixing with the pine smoke from the fireplace. 4 generations of garrison men bickering about football while the women rolled their eyes and made the real decisions. That noisy, chaotic, comforting kind of family normal, the kind that makes you grateful for the people who drive you insane. And that's when Sheriff's Deputy Martinez appeared at our door, hat in hand, looking like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "Ma'am, sir, I hate to do this, but I have to serve you with a 48-hour evacuation notice." He handed over the paperwork with the expression of someone being forced to kick puppies. Martinez was a veteran. He'd served in Iraq, you could tell, and he recognized military bearing when he saw it. "Look, Sergeant," he said quietly. "Something about this doesn't smell right, but by law I have to serve these papers. You all better find legal help, and fast." Here's what I uncovered about emergency demolition orders. By Montana law, they're supposed to come with at least 10 days' notice and include a court-reviewed process for properties that pose real threats to public safety. Somehow, Vivian persuaded a county judge that our cabin was such an immediate hazard that none of those protections applied. The moment I learned this, I called military legal aid, treating the situation like an act of hostility. Captain Rodriguez didn't hide her outrage when I explained the timeline. "Sergeant, this violates at least 15 separate due process standards. Emergency demolitions require documented imminent danger, not just an inspector's opinion about dock safety." While I was coordinating the legal pushback, my family mobilized like the task force we had unintentionally become. Dad reached out to FBI contacts about civil rights violations committed under color of law, because when officials misuse their power to strip away constitutional rights, that crosses into federal crime territory. Mom, meanwhile, opened an IRS probe into Vivian's construction company. After all, nothing screams corruption like hiring your own firm to demolish the very property you've been targeting. Mackenzie worked with the sheriff's office to dig into Dale's bogus inspections. Turns out 3 other counties were already raising eyebrows about why their inspector always found issues that required his friend's construction crew to fix. But the real break came when Mom's IRS training uncovered something stunning in the tax records. Vivian had been classifying our cabin as abandoned and condemned on her own filings for 2 years. That little trick lowered her property tax bills by claiming the neighborhood's value had dropped. She had literally been profiting off harassing us long before she even tried the demolition stunt. "She's been laying the groundwork for this for years," Mom said, spreading documents across the kitchen table like a detective presenting case evidence. Every violation, every bogus complaint, it's all been part of her plan to take this land. And then came the smoking gun. Vivian's own construction company was already positioned to carry out the demolition contract. She had hired herself to tear down our cabin based on fraudulent inspections from an unlicensed inspector who also happened to be in her debt. It was like discovering the arsonist also wrote the fire insurance policy. That same evening, while we scrambled to prepare injunctions and federal complaints, Vivian convened an emergency HOA meeting to celebrate what she called the successful resolution of community safety issues. She even invited local reporters to witness her leadership in protecting property values. Her triumphant speech echoed on the radio while we packed family heirlooms, sounding eerily like enemy propaganda, confident lies delivered with total conviction. She vowed to restore the lakeshore's natural beauty once the non-compliant structure was gone, which everyone could translate as her own expansion project. But in her pride, Vivian slipped up. On the record, in front of the media, she admitted orchestrating the harassment campaign, exactly while federal agents were already compiling evidence of racketeering, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. The rush of adrenaline during those 72 hours was all too familiar, the same sharp metallic urgency I'd felt before combat missions overseas, except this time the enemy had just broadcast their entire battle strategy live, standing on a minefield of federal crimes. By Monday, our emergency injunction was filed. Federal investigations were in motion, and Vivian Blackthorne didn't yet realize she had declared war on the United States government itself. She thought she was demolishing a cabin. In reality, she was building her own prison out of documented felonies. Mom's IRS background in financial crimes became the key that unlocked the entire scheme. While Dad was assembling federal charges and Mackenzie coordinated with law enforcement, Cordelia Garrison did what she does best. Follow the money trail criminals, always think they've hidden. "Dex, you need to see this," she called, waving me over to her laptop at 2 a.m. The dining table looked like a command post, covered in tax forms, corporate filings, and printouts, while the smell of coffee and glow of computer screens made the whole scene feel like a war room. What she uncovered was elegantly simple and devastating in its implications. In 2019, buried in a web of shell companies, Vivian had bought 12 acres of prime lakefront right next to our cabin. The purchase went through Serenity Development LLC, with her listed as managing partner. And the kicker? The county permits. She filed outline plans for a $2.3 million luxury glamping resort, upscale camping with Wi-Fi and room service, but the permit carried one condition. The project required the removal of all non-conforming structures on adjacent lots. Our cabin wasn't just an obstacle, it was the single barrier standing between Vivian and millions. As Mom kept pulling records, the full picture became painfully clear. Over the last 2 years, 5 other families along the lakefront had endured the same campaign of harassment. The pattern was identical: fabricated violations, the same inspector, and steadily intensifying intimidation, but here's where it crossed into federal crime. Vivian had been abusing her HOA power to manufacture property issues, then swooping in with offers to purchase those homes for far less than they were worth. "That's classic racketeering," Mom said, pointing to highlighted financial records on her screen. "She's been weaponizing official procedures to strip people of their property rights for her own gain. The FBI literally has a handbook on this type of scheme." The most astonishing part was that Vivian had documented all of it herself. Her construction company's tax filings revealed $340,000 in questionable consultation fees funneled to county officials over 3 years. Remember Dale, the crooked inspector? He'd been receiving monthly payouts disguised as retainers for structural assessments, and it went deeper. Vivian's brother-in-law just happened to be the president of First Mountain Bank, the same institution that pre-approved a $2.3 million construction loan for Serenity Development LLC. What we were looking at wasn't just corruption. It was a family-run operation designed to seize lakefront land under the cover of government authority. We'd uncovered what prosecutors label a criminal enterprise, multiple individuals exploiting official positions in a coordinated effort to commit crimes for profit. The HOA harassment wasn't about us personally. It was simply the front end of a much larger property theft scheme. "Check this timeline," Dad said, drawing lines between the property acquisitions, the harassment campaigns, and the bank loan approvals. "She's been setting this up for at least 4 years. Every single family she's gone after owns land that blocks her development plans." That's when it hit me why my background in military intelligence had been so valuable in fighting back. Vivian wasn't just a shady HOA president. She was orchestrating a complex criminal conspiracy. It required charting networks, tracking money trails, and recognizing how corrupt players work in concert. The balance of power had flipped completely. Just a day earlier, we were a military family trying to protect our cabin from bureaucratic abuse. Now we were holding proof of a multi-million-dollar federal crime ring that had been quietly stripping American families of their homes for years. Vivian believed she was clearing the way for her resort by tearing down our cabin. What she'd really done was hand federal investigators a detailed blueprint of her entire operation, preserved in her own tax records and business filings. She had placed so much faith in her local political cover that she'd overlooked one critical fact. When you commit crimes against federal employees, you invite federal agencies into the fight, and their reach extends far beyond the limits of local corruption. Tuesday morning, our fight was no longer just about protecting our cabin. We were holding enough proof to dismantle an entire criminal network hiding behind the facade of neighborhood governance. By Wednesday morning, our dining room had morphed into something resembling a federal operations hub. Military-style charts papered the walls, evidence timelines sprawled across whiteboards, and 4 federal agencies were now coordinating the takedown of what had been revealed as a multi-million-dollar crime syndicate. The air smelled of industrial-strength coffee, and the nonstop hum of laser printers set the soundtrack as we built what Dad called the most thoroughly documented local corruption case he'd seen in nearly 3 decades with the FBI. Each of us had taken the lead in our area of expertise, and watching the coordination was like witnessing a precision tool engineered specifically for dismantling organized crime. Franklin spearheaded the federal prosecution strategy. "This isn't about HOA harassment anymore," he said while sorting evidence into case-ready files. "This checks every major federal box: conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, racketeering, mail fraud, wire fraud, even laundering money through construction projects." His FBI contacts in the public corruption unit could hardly contain their excitement. Federal prosecutors especially relish cases where local officials abuse authority for personal profit, more so when they target military families. The FBI handbook practically has a chapter written about schemes like this, and Vivian had followed it like a blueprint. Mom, with her background in the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, turned financial expertise into something resembling economic warfare. She tracked every bank account, property, car, and asset tied to the operation. "By the time we're through with asset forfeiture," she said with the satisfaction of a veteran investigator, "Vivian will regret ever hearing the word lakefront." Ironically, Vivian's greed had built her own trail of evidence. Every consulting fee bribe, every shell company transfer, every bogus expense, all of it was recorded in tax filings she'd signed under penalty of perjury. The IRS has forensic tools capable of reconstructing financial crimes a decade back, and Vivian had been obligingly generating her own digital paper trail the entire time. Mackenzie managed the multi-agency enforcement response with the sharp precision of someone used to investigating explosive networks. "Dale's fake inspections don't just break state licensing laws," she explained while working with sheriff's offices in 3 counties. "When he falsifies structural safety reports for demolitions, he's potentially violating federal explosives regulations. Every building condemned under one of his forged inspections is technically a federal crime scene." Her ATF database dives uncovered that Dale's fraudulent inspection racket stretched across state lines. His profit-driven lies had already contributed to deaths. 2 people killed in the 2019 bridge collapse he'd certified as safe. Federal prosecutors were lining up charges serious enough to keep him locked away for decades. My responsibility became classic military intelligence, threat assessment, and strategic coordination. I built operational timelines, mapped communication webs among conspirators, and conducted pattern analysis that exposed how each crime fed into the wider enterprise. But what made our effort so powerful was this: every step we took carried legitimate federal authority. When Dad's FBI team requested surveillance warrants, judges signed off instantly. When Mom's IRS unit launched asset seizures, banks complied immediately. When Mackenzie's ATF contacts looped in county sheriffs, those departments treated it like the federal priority case it truly was. Within a week, we had assembled a community intelligence network that could rival a military operation. The retired Marine running the local newspaper became our media strategist. A Navy veteran who owned the surveying firm contributed technical property assessments. 5 families who had been harassed stepped up as cooperating federal witnesses, each providing key evidence of Vivian's campaign of intimidation. Even the local hardware store owner, a Vietnam veteran, had quietly spent 3 years documenting who Vivian denied supplies to. "I knew something was off," he told us, handing over his detailed records. "I just didn't know who to bring it to until now." The arsenal of tools at our disposal could have impressed any federal case team: professional-grade surveillance equipment, forensic financial software, legal research databases, and military planning systems adapted for civilian deployment. But the real advantage was that we had 4 family members who knew exactly which federal levers to pull and how to coordinate across agencies that rarely communicate smoothly. By the end of the second week, we weren't just probing Vivian's wrongdoing, we were piecing together a fully mapped criminal organization with enough evidence to charge at least a dozen co-conspirators. The woman who thought she was pushing around a single military family had unknowingly picked a fight with a de facto federal task force armed with limitless jurisdiction and resources. The taste of victory was already seeping into the coffee. Vivian had no clue that her empire was under constant federal watch, that every call was tapped, every transaction flagged. By the 3rd week, she must have sensed the net tightening. Agents were asking questions at banks, courthouses, and construction sites. Her phones were bugged, her finances scrutinized, and her allies were beginning to panic. That's when she made the same fatal error every desperate criminal makes: escalation. It began with sabotage that she probably thought looked subtle. Supposed maintenance crews showed up at odd hours, claiming to conduct routine checks, but these weren't utility workers. They came armed with tools meant to damage, not repair. Electrical lines were mysteriously cut, the water pump suddenly failed, and the septic system bore damage that looked a lot like deliberate sledgehammer blows. The advantage of military intelligence training is learning to anticipate how adversaries escalate. I'd already positioned trail cameras along the entire perimeter. The footage we captured was so sharp, it could have been the opening sequence of a crime documentary. Vivian's crew went to work dismantling our property while she sat in her BMW, orchestrating the whole thing like a commander directing sabotage. The air carried a sharp mix of sweat, diesel fumes, and the metallic tang of cut copper. Fear and desperation rolled into one. These weren't hardened criminals. They were regular construction workers lured by promises of easy money for minor fixes, only now realizing they'd been pulled into federal offenses. Her fatal misstep, though, was targeting federal employees. She began mailing anonymous letters to security offices, claiming we were unstable, abusing our government ties, and therefore a threat. Her goal was to trigger clearance reviews and FBI probes into the very people investigating her. That's when things crossed into personal territory for my family, something Vivian clearly hadn't calculated. Threatening federal staff doesn't just break the law. It sets off counterintelligence protocols built to safeguard national security. Within 2 days, the FBI was treating her harassment as a threat to federal operations. Dad was almost amused, remarking, "She's just graduated from local corruption to threatening federal agents while syncing with FBI colleagues. That's the kind of error that turns 5 years behind bars into 20. Meanwhile, Vivian staged what she called a community safety meeting, painting herself as the victim of government bullying. She spun stories of our supposedly unstable veteran family leveraging federal clout to terrorize innocent community leaders. The irony was almost poetic, a criminal ring crying foul because law enforcement was catching up to them. She fed local newspapers tales of government abuse, even hiring a PR firm to frame her group as heroes fighting oppression. All the while, she was spending thousands documenting her own obstruction of justice in plain view. Her incompetence peaked when she ran this smear campaign through the very phones and email accounts already tapped by federal surveillance. Every planning call, every falsehood, every manipulation attempt was neatly recorded by the same agencies she was trying to undermine. Her recklessness escalated into outright bribery. She thought slipping $25,000 in cash to one of Dad's FBI colleagues at a coffee shop might make some paperwork disappear. She handed over the envelope while being recorded unaware. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for attempting to bribe a federal officer," Agent Rodriguez told her, and in that instant, you could almost hear her world collapse. To top it off, the takedown unfolded in a crowded cafe right in front of neighbors who watched their HOA president let out in cuffs. That very day, Dale, the fake inspector, was picked up while trying to skip the state. But when ATF agents are after you, crossing state lines won't help. Mackenzie had coordinated with multiple agencies, and Dale's escape attempt ended in a Walmart parking lot in Wyoming, face down, handcuffed, broadcast on local news, and replayed across social media. That moment marked the collapse of Vivian's empire. Her business seized, bank accounts frozen, and co-conspirators scrambling to outdo one another in striking plea deals. That evening, the mountain air carried the sweet smell of victory as we sat on our shaky dock watching news helicopters circling above. Years of her bureaucratic terrorism crumbled the instant she tried bribery and witnessed Dale's arrest. Panic set in. That's when criminals make their worst mistakes, when they realize the investigation isn't going away. She turned to destroying evidence and silencing witnesses, but obstructing justice in a federal case is like dousing an already raging fire with gasoline. The first sign came at 3 a.m. one Tuesday. Her construction office mysteriously went up in flames. The fire consumed file cabinets stuffed with contracts, financial records, and county communications. Investigators quickly found accelerant traces and smashed hard drives, clearly destroyed before the blaze. But in the digital age, nothing vanishes. Federal investigators had already subpoenaed bank data, email servers, and cloud storage. She was burning her own copies of evidence prosecutors had secured weeks earlier. "She's actually helping us," Mom chuckled from her IRS office, flipping through the arson report. Now we get to tack on obstruction and insurance fraud to the racketeering charges. She's committing new crimes to cover the old ones. Her desperation deepened when she began threatening other families aiding investigators. Anonymous letters warned that siding with outside agitators would harm their reputations and businesses. She had essentially left a paper trail of witness intimidation, about as bright as leaving fingerprints on a murder weapon. Her crowning act of criminal stupidity was faking a break-in at her own house. She called deputies, claiming we had planted, threatening notes, military gear, and surveillance devices to frame her. Problem was, my military intelligence background makes spotting phony evidence second nature. The police report read like a parody. Store-creased paper for the threats, camping equipment sold at Walmart presented as military gear, and smoke detectors with labels peeled off passed off as spy tech. Deputy Martinez, the Iraq veteran who'd once served us demolition papers, took one glance and called in the feds. "This is the most obvious staged crime scene I've ever seen," he told Dad's FBI team. "She planted evidence so bad my kid could spot it from the backyard." Meanwhile, Dale's capture set off a domino effect of confessions. The county commissioner, who had pocketed her bribes, chose cooperation over prison. The bank president, her own brother-in-law, suddenly remembered long conversations about coordinated loan schemes tied to property harassment. Even the construction crew who'd trashed our cabin lined up to testify for lighter sentences. And then came her last, disastrous move. She didn't run physically, but financially. She tried shuffling assets offshore, selling properties, and creating shell companies to hide money. Every move was tracked in real time by agencies specializing in financial crimes. "She's like a trapped animal thrashing harder every second," Mackenzie observed while liaising with ATF financial teams. "Every step she takes just produces more evidence and brings more agencies in. At this point, she's in violation across FBI, ATF, IRS, Treasury, maybe even Homeland Security." Surveillance footage from this phase revealed a woman unraveling, her BMW darting between banks, lawyers' offices, and government buildings at strange hours, desperately hunting for someone who could erase her problems. The irony? Every meeting, every call, every wire transfer was being logged live by federal investigators. Her final gamble was attempting to bribe a federal judge. She tapped an old law school acquaintance, now a prosecutor, to pass along a message. That call lasted all of 43 seconds before the prosecutor hung up and immediately alerted authorities to attempted judicial bribery. Within just a few hours, Vivian had managed to tack on obstruction of justice and attempted bribery of federal officials to her already lengthy list of criminal charges. By Friday evening, I found myself sitting on our so-called dangerous dock, with a beer in hand, watching federal surveillance helicopters sweep across the sky. That's when it struck me. Vivian had racked up more crimes trying to bury her initial wrongdoing than she had in the original conspiracy. She'd built her own federal prison, stacking felonies like bricks. Saturday morning's annual Lake Serenity community safety meeting was supposed to be Vivian's big moment. She had planned it as a showcase at the community center, media invited, a packed crowd, and a promised special recognition ceremony for outstanding leadership. 200 residents filled the building expecting the usual dull HOA updates on snow removal and dock regulations. Instead, they witnessed one of the most spectacular public collapses in Montana local government history. What Vivian didn't know was that every federal agency investigating her had coordinated to make this her final act. FBI agents posed as concerned citizens in the audience. ATF investigators lined the back row with cameras rolling. IRS criminal agents covered the exits. Even prosecutors from the U.S. Attorney's Office had come, knowing this was the end of her free days. Our family entered with the garrisons, me leading in full-dress uniform. The room erupted in applause, starting with the veterans, spreading quickly to everyone else. The energy shifted instantly. This wasn't going to be Vivian's show anymore, but she played her part, walking to the podium with the polished smile. She'd perfected over 3 terms as HOA president. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice dripping with false confidence, "I want to address the recent unpleasantness caused by certain individuals using government connections to intimidate and harass hardworking community volunteers." She locked eyes with my family as she spoke. Lake Serenity should be a place where honest families can pursue the American dream without outside interference. The crowd murmured restlessly. Neighbors who'd been targeted by her schemes recognized the lies disguised as community service, yet she doubled down, claiming credit for removing hazards and non-compliant structures she said threatened safety and property values. That's when I asked to speak on behalf of our military family. The room went silent as I hooked my laptop to the projector and played surveillance footage. Vivian's contractors cutting our power lines, wrecking our water systems, smashing property, while she gave instructions from her BMW. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're seeing is documented evidence of criminal conspiracy gathered during a federal investigation," I announced. The crowd erupted. My dad rose, his voice commanding the room. "I'm Special Agent Franklin Garrison with the FBI. The investigation into systematic civil rights violations, racketeering, and public corruption has resulted in multiple indictments." The true showstopper came when Dale, the inspector, was marched in wearing handcuffs, escorted by ATF agents. Gasps rippled through the audience as he confessed, "She paid me to falsify safety reports so she could seize properties. Every violation, every condemnation, every demolition order, it was all coordinated to steal lakefront property for her project." Vivian's composure finally cracked. She screamed about government overreach and persecution of honest citizens, but her shouts were drowned by the outrage of neighbors realizing how deeply she'd betrayed them. Then Mom took the floor, presenting the IRS findings like a seasoned forensic accountant. The defendant laundered bribes through her construction company, evaded taxes on $340,000 of unreported income, and defrauded the federal government, all while targeting military families. Other families stood up to testify. Business owners described intimidation tactics. The local hardware store owner revealed years of records showing how Vivian had weaponized building supply access. The energy in the room was electric. This wasn't just about us anymore. It was about a whole community finally seeing the truth. Vivian tried one last desperate line. "This is a vendetta by federal employees who can't accept legitimate community governance," but her words collapsed under the sound of handcuffs clicking. "Ma'am, you have the right to remain silent," Agent Rodriguez announced. The room went completely silent as the Miranda rights echoed through the hall. News cameras captured. Every second as Vivian was led away. That's when I delivered the line I'd been saving. Ma'am, you destroyed our cabin thinking we were just another powerless military family. You forgot we swore an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Today, justice comes home. 6 months later, Vivian Blackthorne was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $2.3 million in restitution. The gavel fell before a packed courtroom filled with Lake Serenity residents. Dale received 18 months and lost all his licenses. The county commissioner resigned in disgrace after admitting to bribery, but the true victory wasn't just locking up criminals. It was watching a wounded community heal. Our civil settlement restored our cabin and added punitive damages that sent a clear warning. Bureaucracy weaponized against families carries a heavy price. Every targeted family received restitution, and legal precedent was set. HOA harassment of military families would now be treated as a federal civil rights violation. We rebuilt our cabin on the same foundation my grandfather had laid, only stronger, modern. Safety features, accessibility upgrades, and a wraparound porch big enough for 3 generations of garrisons at Sunday dinner. Fresh cedar and lake breeze mixed with Mom's chocolate chip cookies replaced the diesel fumes and fear that once lingered here. Now kids cannonball off our dock in the summer, their laughter carrying across water that reflects nothing but blue, sky, and freedom. That's what lake property is meant to be, bringing people together, not tearing them apart through legal manipulation. Lake Serenity dissolved the old HOA and replaced it with a transparent, accountable community organization. The state legislature even passed the Service Members HOA Protection Act, inspired by our fight, protecting military families across Montana. We also started the Lake Serenity Veteran Scholarship Fund, awarding college scholarships to military families who faced legal battles while serving. The annual fundraising fishing tournament has become the town's biggest celebration, a day where fresh bass, laughter, and solidarity replace years of division. Federal agencies launched an HOA Abuse Task Force, and our story inspired reform movements in 23 states. A documentary, When David Has a Federal Badge, sparked national conversation about defending homeowners from petty tyrants hiding behind titles. Here's what every homeowner should remember. Always verify HOA legal status with your state database. Expired groups can't enforce rules, but they'll try until called out. Document everything with timestamps. Proving conspiracy requires evidence of coordination, and most importantly, abuse of authority for personal gain crosses into federal crime. The system has tools to protect you. You just need to know which agencies to contact and have the courage to stand up when bullies think their badges make them untouchable. Next week, I'll share my sister Mackenzie's story about a corrupt sheriff who made the fatal mistake of threatening a federal explosives investigator. Compared to that, our HOA war looks like a warm-up. But first, I want to hear your stories. Share your HOA nightmares in the comments. Some of them even become federal cases once families know their rights. Have you dealt with power-hungry board members playing king or queen? Drop your stories below. Let this community remind you you're not alone. Hit subscribe and ring the bell for more HOA stories, where we show how justice works when citizens push back. Tonight, the breeze carries the sound of families laughing. By lakefront fire pits, cedar logs crackling, fish jumping in waters that belong to everyone, not just those who try to steal them. This is America when good people refuse to let corruption win. Justice tastes like victory, sounds like community, and feels like home, because bullies can't survive in the light of federal investigation. Thanks for joining us here at HOA Stories. If you enjoyed watching an HOA Karen finally face justice, click like, drop a comment, and subscribe so you don't miss next week's showdown.